Bienvenidos a esta nueva conferencia. Buenas tardes. Bienvenidos a esta nueva conferencia online de Casa Árabe, la tercera del ciclo de Aula Árabe Universitaria, sobre el impacto del COVID-19 en el Mediterráneo. La conferencia será a cargo de Nathalie Tocci, directora del Instituto Affari Internazionali de Roma y asesora especial del Alto Representante de la Unión Europea y vicepresidente de la Comisión, Josep Borrell. Aula Árabe es un programa de cooperación interuniversitaria que organizamos con las universidades de Madrid y en el que traemos, o en este caso conectamos, con expertos internacionales a propuesta de los programas universitarios que participan en ella de dichas universidades. En este caso, la sesión que organizamos hoy la realizamos en colaboración con el máster de la Unión Europea y el Mediterráneo de la Universidad Complutense de Madrid. Comentar que estamos emitiendo en directo en YouTube, con lo que los estudiantes de dicho programa y otros programas de Aula Árabe y también de Aula Mediterránea que pueden conectar hoy con nosotros, podéis dejar constancia de vuestra asistencia a través del chat del canal de YouTube. En este caso, si os interesa, por favor, dejar escrito en el chat vuestro nombre, apellidos, el programa universitario y la universidad, para que así también quede registro a efectos luego de la certificación de Aula Árabe. Y luego también podéis usar el chat para transmitir vuestras preguntas a nuestra invitada de hoy, Nathalie Tocci, la doctora Tocci. A partir de aquí voy a hablar en inglés para que también ella pueda entendernos. Welcome to this third conference of the Aula Árabe Universitaria program. We are joined today by Nathalie Tocci from Rome, to whom I would like to extend our thanks for agreeing to participate in this session. Thanks a lot, Nathalie, once more for being with us today, in spite of your tight agenda. And as mentioned, we are organizing this conference in collaboration with the Master of the European Union and the Mediterranean, Historical, Cultural, Political, Economic, and Social Basis, from the Complutense University of Madrid. So prior to giving the floor to Ms. Dr. Tocci, I would like to welcome as well Cristina García Fernández, coordinator of the master, and invite her to explain us a bit the interest of this conference in the framework of the program of studies. So Cristina, thank you for being with us today, and the floor is yours.
Muchas gracias, Olivia, y muchas gracias a todos por organizar estas sesiones tan estupendas. Y bueno, pues hoy nos toca el máster en la Unión Europea y el Mediterráneo y es pues un honor y un placer para mí estar aquí como coordinadora y como directora del máster. Y por supuesto de escuchar a nuestra invitada, Nathalie, que nos va a hablar de algo muy actual y muy importante en nuestras vidas y en la vida actual, ¿no? Como es el impacto del COVID-19 en el Mediterráneo, ¿no? En los países del Mediterráneo. Nuestro máster, el máster en la Unión Europea y el Mediterráneo, pues abarca estos temas que hoy en día pues, se han tornado de gran actualidad y realmente lo que pues nos interesa es también plantear cuestiones interesantes, tanto ahora como sobre todo al final de la charla, y que tanto nuestros alumnos como todos los invitados que están conectados pues puedan un poco avanzar y podamos todos avanzar y entender qué está pasando y sobre todo qué nos va a ocurrir, ¿no? En un futuro próximo que es todo con tanta incertidumbre, ¿no? Y yo plantearía una cosa así un poco de entrada ya antes de dar paso a Nathalie, y es que realmente esto del COVID-19 pues nos está poniendo en una situación de mucho estrés en lo que atañe las relaciones entre la Unión Europea y los países del Mediterráneo, ¿no? Una situación que uno se plantea, pues eso, hasta qué punto nos estamos poniendo justamente en ese punto de mira de la Unión Europea, estos países, y realmente si la Unión Europea será capaz de ser solidaria, ¿no? Como parece que está intentando de alguna forma serlo, pero que luego aparecen otros países que no tanto. Y bueno, la idea es seremos capaces, ¿no?, de avanzar en esta solidaridad entre nuestras relaciones con la Unión Europea, ¿no? Y esperemos que sí. Y bueno, no os entretengo más, encantada de estar con vosotros y si queréis, Olivia, damos paso a nuestra invitada.
Perfecto, muchísimas gracias, Cristina, porque this connects very well with our main subject today, which is, as mentioned, the impact of the COVID-19 in the Mediterranean. So as mentioned, we are not going to speak about the impact of the pandemics in terms of the health, social and economic crisis it's creating, but how it's affecting policies and international agendas, in particular the European agenda in the Mediterranean. The pandemics has highlighted the difficulties, as Cristina mentioned, to coordinate policies both at the national and at the international level, and in that sense, also for the European Union and its neighborhood, and in this case, the Mediterranean. So in her role as special advisor to the European Union, High Representative and Vice President for the Commission, Josep Borrell, and previously to her predecessor, Federica Mogherini, Dr. Tocci was in charge of preparing the European Global Strategy, launched in 2016, and working on its implementation. So with this background in mind and this experience, he will speak of the current pandemic's impact on the European agenda and how it has affected multilateralism as we know it, focusing in which forms of multilateralisms are effective, especially in terms of promoting conflict resolution. So Dr. Tocci's point of analysis is that in spite of the European belief, not all forms of multilateralisms are good. So she will explain today what this means and which are its implications for European agenda in the Mediterranean, given her experience both in research and policy strategy. As mentioned, Nathalie Tocci is director of the Istituto Affari Internazionali, but as well honorary professor at the University of Tübingen. She holds a PhD in international relations from the London School of Economics, and her research revolves around European foreign policy, conflict resolution, the Middle East, and the Mediterranean. She has held research positions at the Center for European Policy Studies in Brussels, the Transatlantic Academy in Washington, and the Robert Schuman Center for Advanced Studies in Florence. So thanks once again, Nathalie, for being with us today, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you. Gracias, Olivia. Gracias, Cristina. Es un placer estar con vosotros esta tarde. Bueno, voy a pasar al inglés porque si no, lo voy a os contar mucho hoy. Before I move on to the impact of the pandemic on the Mediterranean region and European policies in the Mediterranean region, let me perhaps take one step backwards and briefly give you my sense of where we were when the pandemic hit, where we were in the Mediterranean when the pandemic hit. And I say this simply because I think we have already been undergoing a period in which the region itself has, obviously not only has there been a lot going on in the region, but what has been going on in the region has essentially changed in many respects, or has been changing the way we even understand the region. So, you know, for I think a number of years, in fact, a number of decades, we used to think of the Mediterranean as a more or less cohesive single space. Yes, a space in which there were many conflicts, there were many problems, but we understood the Mediterranean, in fact, in Euro-Mediterranean terms, and this was the vision that we tried to promote. It was a vision that was also embedded within a broader global context in which the hegemony of the United States was dominant, first, of course, limited to the so-called free world during the Cold War, and then extended to the entire world after the fall of the Iron Curtain. Now, I think what we have already been seeing in the region over the course of the last, I would say, decade or so, and very clearly after the Arab uprisings beginning in 2011, is the fragmentation of this region. A fragmentation which has basically predominantly, I would say, affected the Arab world, less so the non-Arab countries of the region, which has seen the emergence of fragility and the exacerbation of political and social and security and economic and climate-related and energy-related fragilities. And this has, in many respects, given rise to what I would define as areas of limited statehood. So basically, the state system that is beginning at times to crack completely, and when then we have had cases of conflict in Libya, in Syria, in Yemen, etc. And even when the state has not collapsed altogether, there are large areas, or small or large areas, within these states in which the state itself does not have absolute control. So we have had areas of limited statehood, state fragilities, conflicts erupting, and obviously all this has been taking place within a broader global context in which the international system had been moving away from the sort of dominance and hegemony of the United States that I was referring to. And this had given already rise to not only new global powers or re-emergent global powers playing a dominant role in the region. One only needs to think about the role of Russia in the region, but also, and perhaps primarily, I would say, regional rivalries playing in to these areas of state fragility and areas of limited statehood. So basically what we've seen in the region before COVID hit was the way in which, whether it is the Russia-West confrontation, the Iran-Gulf confrontation, the Israel-Iran confrontation, the confrontation over political Islam, particularly between, if you like, Turkey on the one hand and the United Arab Emirates and Egypt on the other hand, energy becoming another area of conflictuality. So basically we have seen a region which had always been conflictual, but the quote-unquote old sort of conflict, the old divide, meaning the Arab-Israeli divide, has been compounded with, and in many respects overtaken by, these different rivalries, these different confrontations. This had also meant a second aspect, which is the fact that this has been a region that has become, over the course of the last decade, far more permeable than it ever was. And it is a permeability that obviously has to do with this regional meddling that I was referring to. It has to do with the fragility of states and societies, but basically which has seen increasing interconnections, be it in terms of people, i.e. migration, be it in terms of climate change and its effects that obviously knows no borders, be it because of the permeability of ideas and ideologies. It is a region that basically is now becoming increasingly difficult to clearly separate from other regions. So it is difficult to clearly separate what happens in the Mediterranean as to what happens in sub-Saharan Africa, what happens in the Gulf, the connections again between North and sub-Saharan Africa across the Sahelian belt, the interconnections between the Gulf and the Horn of Africa, the growing impact, the growing interconnections of dynamics between North Africa and the Middle East. And the fact that, for instance, the Eastern Mediterranean, that once upon a time, and I'll come back to this later, was basically a set of issues and conflicts that basically had to do with Greece and Turkey on the one hand, and Cyprus, and the Cyprus conflict on the other, have now become interlinked with many other conflicts and confrontations. They have become interlinked with the energy situation in the region. They have become interlinked with the Libya conflict. They have become interlinked with the conflict over the nature of political Islam and the role of political Islam in political systems. So essentially what we have seen is this increasing permeability, basically, of the different issues, challenges, conflicts, threats affecting the region. So in this rather complicated and complex picture, COVID-19 hits. And COVID-19 hits having, in my view, I would say at least sort of 5 or 6 effects, and let me try and go through them. first point is what we have seen is, although in many respects the world and certainly Europe have become very sort of self-absorbed by what is essentially being viewed, and for very understandable reasons, as an existential challenge that we're facing. So as we've been kind of looking inwards, what has been happening in the region is that there's still been, a lot of change has been going on. And in particular, what we have seen is that many of the conflicts in the region have definitely not stayed put over the last 9 months. Now, in only one case, if we can think of Yemen, for instance, was there for a very brief moment the appearance that the call of the UN Secretary General for a sort of, a humanitarian ceasefire, a global humanitarian ceasefire connected to the pandemic, it looked like in Yemen that was being taken up, but it didn't last very long. If we take all of the other conflicts in the region, we have seen how either the existing dynamics have continued unabated. If we take, for instance, Syria, yes, it is true that Syria, the Syrian conflict is not in the acute phase that it was in previous years, but this is a trend that has not been affected significantly by COVID. It is a trend that predates COVID, in the sense that the acute phase of violence has been sort of overcome because basically, I mean, to all extents and purposes, the Assad regime has consolidated his grip on large swaths of the country. Now, obviously, this does not mean that Syria is anywhere nearer reaching peace in a genuine sense of the term, but there has been this gradual de-escalation of violence, but for reasons that have not been related to COVID. So the dynamics of the Syria conflict have basically remained unchanged. Libya is a conflict where actually over the course of this pandemic, quite a lot has happened. And initially it looked like things were getting worse because what we saw over the course of particularly the spring is a significant increase of Turkey's military presence. Now, of course, Turkey's military presence is not the only external military presence in Libya. So in a sense, in the end, what the effect that this ended up having was a rebalancing of forces, with Turkey, as we know, supporting the UN-backed government of national accord, with the United Arab Emirates, Egypt, and to an extent, Russia too, through its Wagner mercenaries, de facto supporting the onslaught of General Haftar. This created a new balance of forces in Libya, which has seen over the course of this summer the consolidation of a ceasefire. Now, of course, it's a ceasefire that does not necessarily open the way to peace. We can have ceasefires. One only needs to think about the Caucasus these days, Nagorno-Karabakh these days, to realize that you can have a ceasefire that lasts 26 years, and then it simply opens up the way for a new war. If it is not then followed up by a sort of genuine commitment towards negotiation, mediation, and eventually reconciliation. But I say this simply to say that Libya is another conflict in which quite a lot has happened over the course of this pandemic. What we have seen in another flashpoint, which is Iran, and in particular all the developments surrounding the Iran nuclear deal, is again, quite a lot has happened. We have seen the attempts made by the Trump administration over the course of the summer to lead to an eventual snapback of sanctions on Iran. So quite a lot of movement happening in New York in this respect. Fortunately, this did not work out for President Trump. And fortunately, in particular, European powers resisted the attempt at the US imposing snapback of sanctions, given that the United States is no longer a party to the agreement. And then perhaps most significantly, we have seen the emergence of another real flashpoint, which is precisely the Eastern Mediterranean. Now, on the Eastern Mediterranean, what I'd like to say is that I think it's important to make the distinction between, in a sense, old and new conflicts and the way in which they have all been lumped together. And this goes back to a point that I was making earlier about the permeability of this region, the increasing permeability of this region. So in the Eastern Mediterranean, we have, I would say, at least 4 different sets of conflicts that have now been interlinked with one another. We have the quote-unquote old conflicts between Greece and Turkey. I mean, and I say they're old conflicts because they date back to the unsolved issues from Greek independence in 1830, which basically concern the sort of demarcation of maritime waters, of airspaces, the sovereignty of different uninhabited islands, and in fact rocks more than islands in the Aegean Sea, as well as the demilitarized or not status of certain islands. So these are sort of conflicts which have existed for a very long time. In the past, there was, and in particular, if we look at the period from 1999 up until a few years ago, there was a direct channel open between Greece and Turkey. There were direct talks open between Greece and Turkey, which admittedly had not achieved a breakthrough in terms of solving any of these issues. But of course, given that that direct connection was there, it did prevent these disputes from basically entering into a dangerous escalatory dynamic. Then, of course, there is the Cyprus conflict, which again is a conflict that has been there for a very long time. It has been there at least since 1963 with the breakdown of the constitutional order of the Republic of Cyprus, and certainly since then Turkey's military intervention and then occupation of 37% of northern Cyprus. So these two are sort of old conflicts. So then the question is, why did the Eastern Mediterranean as a flashpoint re-emerge over the course of the summer? And the reason I think is that there has been this increasing connection between these two sets of quote unquote old conflicts to new conflict dynamics. The first has to do with energy and gas. And of course, gas in many respects is and has been, rather than a fuel for conflict, or in fact a fuel for peace, has in many respects ended up being instrumentalized by existing conflict dynamics. So it has become in many respects a proxy for other conflict dynamics. And so what we've ended up seeing crystallizing over the course of the last, I would say, 6-7 years, but really reaching a sort of high point over the summer, is the sort of consolidation of a, let me call it coalition, a multilateral endeavor that brings together Greece, Cyprus, Egypt, United Arab Emirates. It brings France, it brings Italy, it brings Israel, it brings a number of countries together, which obviously at face value would make us think, well, this surely must be good news. In fact, it also brings Jordan and the Palestinian Authority. But then you scratch the surface a little bit and you notice, hey, there is one major actor missing here. And of course, that major actor is Turkey. And if you look at the other actors which are involved in these different bilateral, trilateral, or multilateral cooperative endeavors in and around energy, you notice that they all belong to what has now become one side of a geopolitical divide. And in my view, regional cooperation is obviously in general a good thing. Multilateralism is in general a good thing, but it's a good thing to the extent that it does not crystallize, it does not reinforce even further existing conflict divides. And this is what we've seen happening in the region. Then, of course, we have had the Libya piece coming in and fitting into this mess over the Eastern Mediterranean. And it's fitted into this mess in a manner that has emboldened Turkey. So Turkey, as I was hinting at earlier, over the course of the last 6-7 years, had increasingly seen it's, sort of being pushed against a wall. It had increasingly seen a number of countries basically ganging up against it. Through Libya and through its military intervention in Libya and through the relative victory that it achieved in Libya, Turkey, which, as we know, is led by a pretty authoritarian leader, felt emboldened. And, what does the tiger that has its back to the wall do? It tends to lash out. And it has lashed out in a number of ways. And hence, this is my reading as to why the developments in the Eastern Mediterranean and in the Aegean over the summer with, Turkish warships, obviously making Greece feel, sort of very, very uneasy, escalated the way they did. This is basically the culmination of a process that had been building up over the course of, I would say, the last 6 to 7 years. Now, all of this has been happening as I was saying, we have all been worrying about COVID, and yet we see these existing conflict dynamics, and now, is not the time to talk about the Caucasus, given that we're talking about the Mediterranean, but one could make very similar arguments about Nagorno-Karabakh, another conflict that re-erupted over the course of this pandemic. And of course, the two things are not entirely, this is not entirely a coincidence. It is precisely at times because the world is distracted by other things that conflicts tend to re-erupt. Now, this would be, in a sense, sort of bad enough as it was, if it wasn't for the fact that COVID, and here I get more specifically to the direct effects of the pandemic on the region, COVID has and is, and I think will, in many respects, exacerbate even further many of the fragilities and root causes, if you like, of conflict which have afflicted the region. Very clearly, COVID, and I think this is also true for European societies, let alone for countries in the southern Mediterranean, COVID is and will increase further inequalities, social and economic inequalities, inequalities across generations, inequalities across genders, geographical inequalities, and obviously to the extent that inequality and social injustices and the lack of human dignity are and have been already root causes for instability and unsustainability in the region, we will probably see the pandemic affecting this even further. Likewise, we are already seeing, and of course this is in general a good story, the pandemic accelerating the drive for energy transition. Given the felt need to address climate change, and it is a need that is being felt even more strongly over the course of this pandemic. One only needs to see the collapse in the demand for particularly coal and oil, and the sort of jump in the demand for renewables to give a sense of how much COVID is accelerating trends, sort of energy transition trends. Now, as I said, this is obviously in general good news, but I think that specifically if we look at the impact that this may have on the Mediterranean, and in particular on what in the literature have been defined as rentier states in the region, meaning oil-producing states in the region, particularly those oil-producing states that do not have, if you like, that are already in a difficult economic situation. I'm thinking about Algeria, for example. It is clear that it is, again, increasing even further and accelerating even further root causes of unsustainability. We have also seen, and this is just this has been very much obviously in the news over the last weeks, the re-emergence of a problem that we had kind of forgotten about, particularly here in Europe, which is obviously the question of terrorism. This had obviously been sort of front and center of our preoccupations in Europe in the sort of 2015, 2016 period. Then it gradually sort of diluted, and then bang, it came back obviously into the public scene with the events in France, in Austria in recent weeks. Now, of course, this is only indirectly sort of related to the Mediterranean, but to the extent that there is a connection in people's minds to the region, it obviously increases an attitude of European closure vis-a-vis the region. And then the final point I wanted to make on all of this is the impact that all this, that the pandemic may have, and this I'm slightly less sure about, but I still think it's interesting to sort of throw it out there for you. The impact that the pandemic may have on our debates about migration. And here I want to be not entirely pessimistic. I mean, I think that the pandemic in general has helped us in many respects to turn our gaze away from a strict security lens of understanding the world and understanding the region to a more socio-economic lens to understanding the world and understanding the region. And this may actually help in creating a healthier debate about migration, and in particular the contribution of migration also to European societies. I think during the phase of the lockdown, I'd be interested to hear to what extent this was also a debate in Spain. It certainly was part of the debate, for instance, here in Italy. All of a sudden, people discovered the value of migrant workers, particularly in the agriculture sphere. Now, with the news coming out 2 days ago from Germany about the fact that sort of citizens of Turkish origin are at the forefront of discovering the vaccine against COVID-19. Again, this is a different and a positive story that connects debates about migration with debates about the pandemic and the recovery from not only the resilience to the pandemic, and hence the story of the agriculture sector, but also the recovery from the pandemic through a vaccine. Now, this is obviously sort of still very hypothetical, and normally it is far easier to be pessimistic than optimistic when it comes to debating migration. But I wanted to throw out those two threads as possibly sort of positive avenues in terms of having a more constructive debate on these questions. Now, I'm conscious of time, but the last sort of set of points that I wanted to make really have to do with Europe and the region, and what we as European Union do, could do, should do, will do when it comes to the region. Now, I think looking at, in general, the way in which the European Union has reacted to the pandemic, I would like to make sort of two main points, and then perhaps a third and final point, which is more connected to the implications of the elections in the United States on Europe and on Europe in the region. So the first point that I'd like to make is that this could have been the crisis that really did, the straw that broke the camel's back. So this could have been the crisis coming after the Eurozone crisis, coming after the migration crisis, that if Europe had not been up to standard in terms of providing a response to the pandemic, it really could have not only had disastrous consequences in terms of health and the economy, but it would have probably had disastrous consequences for the very future of the integration project. I don't think that we could have afforded another failure. And in honesty, I think that this is something that European leaders understood and acted upon. And I see, I mean, we will see whether the decisions that have been taken may or may not end up being enough for the magnitude of the crisis that we're facing. But I think that in honesty, we have seen an important European response, an important economic European response in dealing particularly internally with the pandemic, and in particular, of course, with the economic repercussions of the pandemic. And of course, this is good news. And this is what I would define as the sort of half full side of the glass. At the same time, I do think that there is a half empty side of the glass. And this is the second point that I wanted to make on this, which is the fact that because our gaze has shifted from, as I was saying earlier, the security and also foreign policy to the internal policies, particularly social and economic policies, we have basically slightly forgotten about the region. We have basically slightly forgotten about the world. And to an extent, if I look at this as a citizen rather than as a foreign policy expert, I think, well, it's right, I mean, it makes sense. But of course, everything that I was saying in the first part of my talk continues to be the case. Conflicts are still there. In fact, in many respects, they have exacerbated. In other respects, there have been new conflict flashpoints. The fragilities that have inspired, that have triggered so much of the instability are still there, and in fact will likely increase even further. And therefore, there is a far greater need for a European activism in the region than there was pre-pandemic. And yet, the attention at the moment tends to be internal rather than external. And this is, I think, a sort of problem that we will have to grapple with. And then the third and final point that I wanted to make is that I think it is very important to read correctly the results of the US election. Now, of course, as Europeans, we have all been, or almost all been, very relieved by the outcome of the election. I mean, it's no secret that the last 4 years of Donald Trump's presidency of the United States have been probably the hardest ever for the transatlantic relationship. However, I think it would be important not to read the victory of Joe Biden as an illusion of a United States that will return to the world and also, therefore, to the Mediterranean in the manner that, in the way in which it did, back in the 1990s or 2000s. I think it's important, and it would be incredibly irresponsible if, as Europeans, we were to make that mistake, because that world has gone. Whether it's Obama, whether it's Trump, or whether it's Biden, we will not see moving forward a United States re-entering our surrounding regions, including both Europe and the Mediterranean, in a manner that existed in the past, for the simple reason, and this is why I began the way I did, that world of US hegemony is a world that is gone. We're living in a world in which there is going to be a US-China confrontation, which is obviously going to occupy most of the space and the time and the human and non-human capital when it comes to international politics of the United States, of China, and in many respects of the rest of the world, which basically means that when it comes to our part of the world, and by our part of the world, obviously the Mediterranean is an integral part of it, it is mainly going to be our responsibility, and obviously our responsibility together with the region itself. And this is, I think, a very important there will be the temptation to stick our heads in the sand and to think that the good old days are back now that Joe Biden will become president of the United States. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Nathalie. I don't know if I'm connected again. Thank you very much, Nathalie. So, because I think you have covered many of the things we wanted to touch upon. I think you made very big coverage of the conflicts in the region, about how, even if we cannot believe it, or if we believe it or not, a 16 conflict dynamics, as you mentioned, go on in spite of the COVID. Even if we think that COVID is going to finish with everything, things go on and even have different kind of developments. But I'm going to connect with what you mentioned. I mean, because you also mentioned about how, speaking about the part you mentioned about the impact of the COVID, how is exacerbating fragilities of conflicts. And in that sense, it's increasing certain inequalities, and if I may see some socioeconomic structural problems of the region. We were speaking about that at a roundtable last week about employment and youth unemployment in the region, and how the critical situation of things are not changing in that sense, and the COVID is kind of increasing that situation because of the economic impact is having on the region through different factors. So in that sense, that's an important issue to focus, because it's going to be a really focus of increased instability in the region, and we don't know how it's going to lead, given the current development of conflicts in the region. No? So I mean, I like what you mentioned about the positive impact on migration. I mean, I'm happy to hear about that. Listen, if it's taking place in Italy or in other countries, to help to reevaluate the role migration can have in Europe. As a kind of negative note in what concerns at least Spain, we have to also consider that this is taking place in a moment where extreme right parties are kind of increasing their base. So in that sense, I don't know how positive or negative. It's very nice to have some good news about that, but let's see how this develops. And but I'm going to leave it here, because you end with the idea with the role of the European Union in the region, and how what you mentioned about that we shouldn't fall into the illusion that the change in the presidency in the United States is going to change the role of the states, or how the states is not really going to re-enter the region. In that sense, Europe has certain responsibility that has to face, and in that sense, I think I have the other question, a couple of other questions, but I think Christina had a question in relation to the solidarity of the European Union. In the sense, I don't know if, Christina, you want to rephrase it again, and I think we have another question also from the public. So Christina, if you want to start with that, and then we'll go to the other questions. Christina, do you want to rephrase your questions, or shall I?
Just to thank Nathalie. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, just to thank Nathalie. It's been really interesting. I was really listening with all attention to you, because it's all these areas, all these fields, we are dealing with them in the master's degree. So I think our students that are connected will be really interested, maybe in posing some questions to Nathalie. But really, thank you, because it's a very good point what you've made about well, everything, but really for several issues, like that the COVID is going to be maybe a positive issue to energy transition. This is a very good point, because I agree to you, and I think we are trying to deal with all this transition in a better way, or in a more efficient way. So we could comment on this maybe later on with the students. about this impact in energy transition. And what you said lately, it was very interesting too about the maybe the COVID is going to lower a little bit our European project for all the integration. The fact that the US maybe is going on its way, just getting a little bit apart from Europe and dealing with China and this conflict or economic conflict between them. So maybe it could be a positive issue or positive fact for us, for Europeans, in a way that if they go a little bit apart, maybe we can kind of make up our minds and take care about our specific and internal issues. That should be maybe for a while a good point to think about. And yeah, just thank you. Just if you like, we can go later to the students, let the students intervene and pose the questions. Thank you, Nathalie. Very interesting.
Gracias, Cristina. So we have a question from the public, if you want, and it connects very well with this last point we were mentioning about the role of the states or European Union in the region, and also the issue about solidarity that was mentioned previously, where is European solidarity in the region in this regards. It's a question from Bara Mikhail, and it says, what are the concrete steps ahead that shall help the European Union to become a geopolitical actor in the region? And then connecting with what I mentioned about solidarity, he adds, if Nathalie could also answer, or just a kind of idea, how about the European Union providing part of the vaccines when they are here to the MENA countries in need? So that's a very challenging question. So just to start with, we can go with this, Nathalie.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a crucially important question, and I think perhaps I was slightly unfair to the European Union in saying that we've only been thinking sort of about ourselves internally. I mean, I think that was perhaps slightly unfair. I think it is important to note that I think it was in May or June, I can't remember now, that the European Union launched a multilateral initiative to basically join forces, and it raised, if my memory serves me right, about 8 billion euros in terms of pooling resources for research on COVID treatment and vaccine and eventually distribution. So I think in fairness, not only the EU alone, but the EU within multilateral frameworks has been very active in this regard. And I think two other important frameworks that are going to be multilateral frameworks in which it will not be the European Union, but it will be Europeans that will be sort of playing an important role, particularly in 2021, are going to be the G7 and the G20. Which are also going to be working very much on this theme about distribution of a vaccine beyond our borders. And I think the fact that you have two European countries that will chair these multilateral frameworks. G7 will be chaired by the United Kingdom, which of course is going to be out of the European Union, but it could actually be an interesting test case to see whether cooperation with the European Union is actually going to work on something which is obviously a common interest, and Italy that will be chairing the G20. I think these are going to be two important multilateral formats in which Europeans are going to be working on this question of distribution of the vaccine beyond our borders. I think the intention is definitely there. I mean, whether it is in the Mediterranean, in the Balkans, I would say in general in our surrounding regions, it is very much not only in the minds but in the pockets, or what will be the pockets of the European Union in terms of agreeing, sort of now that the agreement finally seems to be there on Next Generation EU, that part of these funds are also going to be channeled indeed to our surrounding regions, and therefore including the Mediterranean, in terms of distribution of vaccine. Of course, inevitably, I would say that the heavy lifting, as I said, is more internal than external. But I think that effort will definitely be there. I think that. So on this, I'm fairly optimistic. I'm far less optimistic when it comes to things that, as Europeans, we feel far more uncomfortable in doing. So we're good at spending money. We're less good at taking risks, particularly when these risks entail the risk to life. And this is why I come back to the example of Libya. I personally think that what we should be doing as Europeans is being present in Libya in order to monitor a ceasefire. But inevitably, monitoring a ceasefire in a situation in which, yes, there may be a ceasefire, but it's still a fairly dangerous situation, has risks, and it entails risks. And this is, I think, an element of risk and responsibility taking, which, on this, I think the United States does have a point towards Europeans. But I think psychologically or politically, we're not there yet. So it's fine, spending money. But when it comes to other forms of taking responsibility, I think we still have quite a long way to go.
Yeah, that will give a good quote. This idea of the Europeans are good at spending money, but not so good at taking risks. But following with you this point, so if I understand your answer to the questions about how European Union can take steps to become a geopolitical actor, your point is that Europe should be more active in, for example, in taking risks at kind of these particular conflicts, like in Libya, and for example, monitor the ceasefire. That's your point. That should be the way of really kind of playing a role there. And
I think it's obviously, I don't want to sort of, sometimes one can then simplify excessively, when the debate about soft power and hard power. But in situations in which there is insecurity, there is a inevitable component. If one is to play a role, one has to also play a role in that respect, which does not mean going for military interventions or anything of the like. But it is about taking risks, including in this field as well, exactly, for things like consolidating a ceasefire. Because if we don't do it, others will do it. And in fact, others are doing it.
Okay. Well, we have another question from the public, and it says, so yeah, I think it's related to the issue. I don't know if I understand it well. I guess it's in relation to the issue of the role Turkey is playing in receiving refugees, because it's saying in the midst of this debate open about migration and refugees in the region, could we state that new states should start incorporating those policies in support and reception of refugees?
Yes, I think on sort of migration and refugee policy, the last 5 years have been years in which we have started, and I go back to the issue of the lens that we use to look at things. We've been looking at migration primarily through a security lens and primarily through an external lens. And again, I don't want to sound too Heidi-like. I do recognize that there is a role to be played by security policy, and there is work to be done with countries of origin and transit. But I think it's a complete illusion to think that one can have an effective migration policy if we don't get the internal piece of it right. And the internal piece of it right is precisely that of sort of revisiting and reaching a common asylum and migration policy. And in order to do so, again, I don't know if this is going to work out. And I think, Olivia, you're absolutely right in the remark that you were saying earlier. It will largely depend on what the impact of the pandemic will ultimately be on the political trends, if you like, the sort of nationalist populist trends in Europe. If they go in the opposite direction, meaning if this is actually a crisis that will in the end not strengthen populists, because this is a crisis which has revealed the fact that sort of expertise matters, competence matters. It is the Merkel type of leadership rather than the Boris or the Trump type of leadership that has tended to work more. So if this is in the end the story that emerges, and therefore if the tide, and of course the victory of Biden is a very important piece of this story, if the overall tide is working against populists, but this is an open question, and if on top we use more of a socio-economic lens and an internal lens, it may help us. I realize this is a sort of tall order, but it may help us actually move towards that common asylum and migration policy, which is the indispensable piece to actually have an effective migration policy, full stop. I think, as I said, I think it's an illusion to think that this is simply something that can be tackled by signing agreements with countries of origin and transit, which are aimed basically at keeping migrants where they are.
Thank you very much. So there is no other question. I don't know if there are any other questions. I have one in relation to these fragilities you mentioned. I want linking also with Barak's question about other ways in which Europe could become a geopolitical actor in the field. No? And I mean, it's not that we are in this week. There will be some celebrations about the 25th anniversary of the Barcelona process and the Barcelona Declaration. So in that sense, I mean, going back to the original spirits of it, this idea of co-development or in the region, and connecting with what we just mentioned about the fragilities that are kind of being increased by the COVID, and especially the problem of unemployment in the region. How do you see? Do you think that it could be a good excuse or a good moment to really relaunch or take some other initiative also in the fields of kind of development, or kind of I don't know where, but I mean, how can some social policies or some kind of dialogue in the region in relation to these issues? I received another 2 questions, so I don't know if you have something to say on this, and then we go back to these other 2 questions that we received.
Yeah, I mean, I think on this, what I would say is, I don't think that this is the time to, for big announcements. I think that this is the time to deliver concrete results. I think often the problem that we have as European Union is that we kind of launch big initiatives. Now, once upon a time, they did actually deliver. I mean, I think in the good old days of the Barcelona process, that really delivered. But already, if you kind of fast forward to the Union for the Mediterranean, it was kind of, more of a, more of a set of announcements than a story of concrete results. And I think the region sees this, and I think that we're not doing ourselves any favors. So I would be, sort of more on the line of, not big announcements, but concrete results. on some of the issues that you mentioned, you know, youth unemployment, climate action, energy transition. I mean, you know, there are plenty of challenges, you know, and showing that we're there, you know, we're there in practice. We're not just there with kind of big slogans and announcements.
So yeah, it's good to hear that it will be plenty of areas in which the European Union could take kind of concrete actions, no, to contribute to the development of the region. So we have these other two questions. I'm going to read the two in case we don't, and then let's see. No, it's another additional one. So how is the European Union reacting to these new terrorist attacks from this new pandemic perspective? Is there any new strategy that will be followed? Thank you.
So how is it reacting to the terrorist attacks?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think that there is a risk, and I want to think that we're not going to fall into the trap. So I think the risk is that of falling back into a sort of clash of civilizations way of understanding the world, the region, and in particular terrorism. Now, this was the mindset that many were in the past, and I don't think that we did ourselves any favors. I sense that this is the line that the French president is taking, and I see the domestic political reasons why he is doing this, given that he's obviously looking ahead at the election in 2022, and the fact that obviously the main contender is most likely going to be Marine Le Pen, that is doing pretty well in the polls. In fact, they are sort of head to head in the polls. So I see the domestic political temptation for Macron to shift to the right, and the proposals that he's been making also in terms of, again, going back to migration, EU migration policy recently also go in that direction, a sort of restricted direction. I don't see many follow, and of course, okay, fine, Austria, we know where Austria, we know where Austria is in. At the moment, thankfully, I don't see many others following this line, and again, I want to believe that with this new sort of more social and economic way of understanding the world and less security obsessed way of understanding the world, it will prevent us from falling back into the civilizational trap that we were in previous years.
Thank you for that answer. I also want to believe that. And we have another question. Do you think that COVID-19 may fuel Euroscepticism in Southern Europe or in Europe in general, or is it an opportunity for European Union to become stronger and more united?
I mean, I think that the risk was there at the beginning of the pandemic, when at the beginning of the pandemic, Europe was not particularly rapid in its response. I think, and certainly here in Italy, I mean, I imagine that in Spain as well, the general sense was, here they go again, you know. I mean, you know, they let us down with the Eurozone crisis. They let us down with the migration crisis, and now they're letting us down again over the pandemic. I think, thankfully, we're not there anymore because there has been a response, and I think there is an acknowledgement that there has been a response. I haven't seen recent sort of Eurobarometer figures on this, but my guess would be that although obviously there is still a high degree of Euroscepticism, it is slightly less than what it was in the spring. And I think that, I mean, I would be very surprised to see a different result. Because I think that there has been a general acknowledgement that, I mean, you know, the European Union has actually done something. It is trying to do something. and it's not perfect, but there has been real money being put on the table, and a real step forward in terms of moving towards, the famed or, sort of otherwise transfer union. This is something that was resisted, especially by Germany over the course of the Eurozone crisis, and now an important step in this respect is being made. So I think that Euroscepticism eventually, if this pandemic is tackled effectively, it will have a positive effect on making citizens slightly fall in love again with the European project, which, yes, I think it is necessary, but not a sufficient condition for a stronger Europe in the world. So it's a necessary condition, obviously. It's not sufficient, because I think for it to be sufficient, what you would also need is to have that willingness to take that responsibility and to take those risks that we were discussing earlier.
Yeah. So we have, in relation to that, we have a question from a Eurosceptic, saying so. They're saying, although, yeah.
See? Yeah, just I agree to Nathalie, and just wanted to say that we could make Europeans. We could make. Can you hear me? Yeah, we could make. Yeah, we could maybe just make a step Europeans in this issue and on the leadership in this area. I think the United States, as you pointed out lately, is maybe losing their leadership in these questions in international issues, and we should, as I said, make a step forward and take this the lead of the international relations and become a leaders. Why not in the international world? Because I think it is time for us to do that, and now we should take advantage and maybe just become this. Take the leadership of this. I don't know what you think about it, but I think it's just a good, you always think that there are good times to make and think of different and new things, and this is
sorry, we lost you a bit.
World. I don't know if you were able to hear me.
Yeah, just the last bit.
Just the last bit. We missed the last part, but
yeah, but I mean, on this, I would agree with you. I mean, I think if not now, then when? Now there is, in a sense, all the need for us to do so. Because our, sort of surrounding regions are in the state that they are, because we are maybe finding again that internal sense of solidarity that we had lost over the last decade, because the United States is not going to sort of come to the rescue, but at the same time we will have a United States that at least is not an adversary. So in a sense, the sort of we don't have any excuses not to do it.
We have.
Thank you.
If we may to take this other last question, Nathalie, do you have time?
Yeah.
We're just going to connect. Is as I mentioned, from there are two last questions. So the first one is, as I mentioned, from an Eurosceptic saying that I'm just reading. The European Union has had a quick response regarding economic measures, as you explained, and has taken a while because the North countries were unwilling to help Southern countries. There is still a problem with the European Union when it comes to coordination, so especially between the states. So if we struggle helping each other out, what can we expect from the European action regarding conflicts in the Middle East? So that's one question. And I was going to, if you can, you mentioned the need to take a risk, for example, Libya, if you could mention regarding these fragilities or this kind of increasing risks that we have in the region, which conflict you see could explode or kind of have more kind of difficult situation in the short term, and where we should take the risks then. And then the second question, we take the two, and then you can just we take the last round. The last question says, what do you think is the role of youth in the European Union and the MENA region regarding COVID and relations in the Mediterranean? So with that, if you want, we can close up.
Okay, so on this youth question, I mean, so much could be said about it, but let me just say one thing, because I mean, I think, you know, youth can and should play into so many ways, but if we just stick to sort of our field, yeah, and our field meaning the field of study and research, for instance, I really feel quite strongly the need to hear more young voices in terms of young researchers in the debate on the Mediterranean, on relations between Europe and the Mediterranean, the Middle East. I mean, we still so often only hear the older voices, which, you know, at times they're extremely competent and everything, but we kind of know what they have to say. And so, you know, I think which kind of goes to a point about what is it that the European Union could be doing is, you know, through its research programs, through its educational programs, really try and bring more. I mean, not only do programs in the region, but do programs in the region specifically aimed at bringing new voices, new young voices into the debate. And this is something that I feel quite strongly about.
I think we lost you.
Conflict.
Okay.
Can you? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, we
in
just
terms of, you know, in terms of which are the conflicts or the potential conflicts that the European Union should be worried about, I mean, it's a very difficult question to answer because let me end on this dramatically pessimistic note. If someone were to ask me, you know, bet all your money on which states are going to exist in the region in 50 years' time, I would struggle to come up with a very long list. I mean, you know, literally, if really with kind of one or two or three exceptions, which are either determined more by a historical reasoning, meaning they've been there for a very, very long time, or because of obviously more sort of, you know, current sort of considerations, but it's not a very long list. And I say this simply to say that I don't think that there is one potential conflict that could erupt. I mean, you know, if Algeria were to erupt, if Egypt were to re-erupt, I mean, if Jordan, if Lebanon, I mean, if any of these countries tomorrow morning you were to sort of switch on the television or the radio or read the newspapers and read something, would you really be surprised? I wouldn't. And this tells us something that we should have learned with the Arab uprisings, meaning that we cannot know, we cannot predict when something is going to happen. But if those conditions of fragility and unsustainability are there, we should be acting upon them now. So I don't think that the European Union should be prioritizing, in this respect, country X over country Y, for the simple reason that pretty much all of them are in a real mess.
Well, let's say, I mean, even if this is a bit negative, as you mentioned, scenario, let's take the positive message that we should be acting urgently in concrete things, and also in this social and economic way of understanding the world, as you mentioned, to go into the roots of the problems and try to tackle them. So I'm afraid we have taken a lot of your time and you have other compromises. So I think we should be closing here. So there are many issues I would like to talk about and we could follow up, but maybe we can continue organizing something in future in relation to the who knows where we are going in the region in the coming months, no? So especially after with the change in the administration in the state that is coming in the next months, for sure it's going to be interesting to follow it up. And because I would like just to thank you once more. It has been very, very interesting talk. It's a pleasure to be able to be here with you, both of you. Thank you very much for connecting from Madrid and from Rome. So thanks a lot for everybody following up from their places. I think there were more than 40-something students at least connecting from different universities. And thank you for everybody. We continue with our debates and conferences online. So muchas gracias a todos una vez más. Gracias a Nathalie y a Cristina y a todos los que nos estáis siguiendo, y continuamos siguiendo la actualidad en el mundo árabe, que es sin duda muy interesante. Gracias a todos. Buenas tardes.
Thank you, Nathalie. Thank you very much.